discussion is what's next for the international left. So I'm just going to read that out. Various left unity initiatives have been taking place since the 2008 economic crisis and subsequent downturn, following Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring. In Germany, we have seen the formation of SYRIZA in Greece and Podemos in Spain. In Germany, Linke appears poised to break into high political office. The attempt at a renewal of leftist politics across different national contexts needs examining. What is the left today? And what role might it play in building new political horizons internationally? All right, so this panel was organized by Platypus, Affiliated Society. Platypus is an international student group, composed of both student and faculty. And Platypus organizes public discussions, focusing on the history of the left, particularly the old, new lefts of the 30s and 60s, as well as what we call the post-political left of the 1990s to today. Examining the problems and tasks that we inherit today and the possibilities for renewal of leftist politics. So with us here today, we have Mike Macnair here on the right. So Mike teaches law and legal history at the University of Oxford. He is co-author with Jamie Goff of the misleadingly titled Gay Liberation in the 1980s, and is author of Revolutionary Strategy, published in 2008, and of various articles on legal, historical, and political topics. Recent examples include Krolkowski and the Myth of Manchesterism, the introduction to Ben Lewis and, Mashish Jorovsky, Krolkowski on colonialism, published in 2013, and Daiglok, or The Inversion of Theory from Anti-Imperialism to Pro-Germanism, published in 2014. He is a regular writer for the Weekly Worker newspaper. So next we have Cam Hardy. Cam was politicized at a young age by the anti-globalization and subsequent anti-war movements. During this period, he joined Canada's leftist New Democratic Party, which was then contemplating diversifying its traditional orientation towards farmers and trade unionists to include the burgeoning new social movements. While an activist in the NDP, Cam studied political science at Victoria University, at the University of Toronto. He currently works as a butcher at a meatpacking plant in Toronto and has spoken publicly on food politics in recent years, as well as being a member of Platypus. So next we have Daniel Rudin. I'm sorry, did I say that right, Dan?
Rudin.
Rudin, okay. So Dan has studied the outcome of the global economic crisis on informal work in Nicaragua, Texas, and the Philippines. He has subsequently worked as a journalist in Manila, covering a labor beat. Daniel is currently researching labor communications and developing a communication system for the Philippine Labor Coalition, NACAIZA. In English, that's United. Daniel periodically does solidarity work for the Philippine Labor Party. He is currently a PhD student in film and digital media at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and also a member of Platypus. So then we have Lucy Parker. Lucy is an artist, archivist, critical theorist, and political organizer. She studied at Goldsmiths College, University of London. She has been involved in anti-austerity campaigns in the UK from 2011 to the present, including the People's Assembly, and is a member of Left Unity and Platypus. So then next we have Ugur Kocack. Ugur was born and raised in Istanbul, Turkey. He has been an active community organizer since he was a teenager. In 2007, he worked as a volunteer for the Thousand Hope candidates campaign for the general elections, and through a drive of grassroots community organizing, they were able to gather about 1.5 million votes in Turkey and form a group in the parliament with 22 Kurdish, progressive, and socialist MPs. Following 2007, he joined the youth organization, the United Front of Leftist Students, with whom he organized many sit-ins and youth protests in Turkey throughout his high school years. Following with the 2011 elections, Ugur has worked with an ever-increasing election bloc of socialists, minorities, LGBTI rights activists, unions and women's rights organizations for 4 elections, the last one being the presidential elections, as one of the members of the Central Campaign Strategy Team. He currently serves as a member of the Central Youth Assembly and Press Commission for the People's Democratic Party in Turkey. He's currently a 3rd year studying public policy here at the University of Chicago, and his BA concentrates on the role of local administration as a part of the peace process in Turkey. So those are our panelists, and I'm going to open it up, starting with Mike Macnair. We will have, each panelist will have about 7 to 8 minutes opening remarks, as well as after that 3 to 4 minutes response, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. All right, thank you. Mike?
Okay, series of short and perhaps somewhat disjointed points. The panel question asks us future of the left. I want to be a little bit cautious about the expression the left. It's drawn from French, 19th century French politics. It's commonplace shorthand. It's capable of being rather misleading shorthand. If we think about the Union de Gauche, the Union of the Left of the Mitterrand administration in France in the 1980s, the left covers over, in this case, attachment to the existing order. Or conversely, left, centre and right in the German socialist movement and the international socialist movement in the pre-First World War period. Part of the left, I've written about Parvus and his co-thinkers, Heinisch, Kuno, Lensch, leftist critics of the centre of the party who became gung-ho supporters of Germany in the First World War. From the left, argued for from left perspective. So the language of left is a little bit cautious. The positive question, in my opinion, is the working class movement. Why? The reason is because at the end of the day, the objectionable dynamics of capitalism, the things which produce the shit, to a considerable extent actually come from small capital, from the aggregate consequences of the needs of small capital as much as they come from big capital. And it's for that reason that it's actually only the working class movement, the movement of the working class as a class, which is capable, potentially, it isn't doing so at the moment, but it's potentially capable of posing an alternative. Second question in relation to these various new leftist formations, how new are they? Well, Movimento Cinque Stelle in Italy, the Five-Star Movement in Italy, that's a new idea. Podemos is a new idea. Die Piraten in Germany is a new idea. But Die Linke is the old Party of Democratic Socialism, which was the governing party in the GDR, rebranded with a little bit of additional forces from the Western Germany. SYRIZA is the old Communist Party of Greece interior, KKE interior, rebranded with some additional leftists added on. The Front de Gauche in France, the French front of the left, is the Communist Party of France in a front together with again smaller elements of the left. It was already true back when this first idea, not the first example, but one of the earlier examples of this idea of new unitary left was Rifondazione in Italy, which is turned out to be collapsed into a disaster, was essentially a large fraction of the old Italian Communist Party with elements of bits of the left, of the rest of the left, added onto it. So not a novelty post-2008, certainly not a novelty post-2008, not really a novelty at all, because what we're really about is the communist parties, the official communist tradition, largely lost their nerve with the fall of Gorbachevism, fall of Stalinism, fall of the Eastern Bloc, and have begun slowly to partially recover their nerve. Third, the question of unity, which is posed by these things, and this arises again out of class politics. It arises because the working class as a class needs common action in order to defend its interests, and that need for common action is reflected in trade union organisation, reflected in tenants' associations, reflected in cooperatives, reflected in mutual societies, reflected in the attachment of working class the working class as a class to collectivist forms of politics. And the consequence of that is that people who present as splitters pay a political price. And that's true of the KKE in Greece, the official Greek Communist Party, which was once called the KKE exterior. It's true of the far left, the Trotskyists in Greece, organised in the part of the Trotskyists in Greece which is organised in the Antasia coalition. By presenting as splitters, they pay a political price. But there's a problem which is posed in turn by that, which is, what about forming a government? And this is what's new. SYRIZA in Greece is in government. SYRIZA is in government, in coalition with the ANEL, the Independent Greeks right-wing nationalist organisation. And the question is SYRIZA, the SYRIZA government, going to be able to break the austerity which is imposed on Greece or not? 2 minutes, okay, great. And if SYRIZA, there's a real big issue here, because if SYRIZA is successful, it's not excluded that SYRIZA will be successful. How is it going to be successful? Maybe it will be successful because the game which they're playing at the moment is we, the Greeks, will make a bloc with Putin's Russia and thereby contribute to outflanking NATO on its southern flank and supporting the operations of the Russians in Ukraine. And if we do that, then we're going to create a situation where the United States, for geopolitical reasons, leans on the Germans to forgive Greek debt. That's the game of nerves which is at present being played. If SYRIZA succeeds in doing that, the interesting question is, what's the outcome of that? Actually, the outcome of that is just more geopolitics. It's not more socialism, but it's more geopolitics. It's more of the game which has been being played by both two sides in Ukraine. On the other hand, it's perhaps a better option than if SYRIZA is defeated, because if SYRIZA is defeated, what we get is a rerun of the utter catastrophe of Rifondazione. Rifondazione went into government as a minority, broke up over geopolitical questions as a party. And the present situation as a result is that the workers' movement in Italy is weaker even than the workers' movement in the Netherlands or the United Kingdom, which is quite a remarkable, given the history of the workers' movement in these countries, it's a really remarkable outcome of the destructive effects of going into government. So my judgment, and the judgment of the party of which I'm a member, is that the likely outcome of the SYRIZA government is another disappointment and another catastrophe from the point of view of working class political organisation. But we don't exclude the possibility that it may be possible to for there to be a different outcome. But if there is a different outcome, the direction in which that different outcome moves is not, in fact, a socialist, a collectivist, a leftist alternative, but a nationalist alternative, and one which moves in the direction of the reformation of competing international imperial blocs. That's it.
Okay. Thank you. Then we have Cam.
Hi. So, as I'm Cam Hardy. I'm from Toronto, and I'm a member of Platypus. I think what I'm going to try to do today is address some of the questions of this panel. And apologies, I have a cold, so I probably sound pretty rough right now. But address some of the questions of this panel in reference to the Canadian context, and can maybe provide a bit of information about the experience there. I think Mike's good to raise the question of why we say the left as opposed to the working class movement, because the left is, I think, by design in terms of the usage of this panel question, a kind of vague concept. But it's something we can definitely hash out more in the question and answer. But I think if you raise the question of where the working class movement is at, or what immediate future it has, the answer is a lot simpler, and it probably doesn't need necessarily a panel to discuss, because at least where I'm living now, it's nowhere. So instead, you have to kind of discuss the sort of social activism that has become dominant since the rise of what we could call the post-political left, the 90s activist left, the milieu that I was politicized in. So I think it's good to point out that these sort of unity initiatives aren't new, and in a lot of cases, as Mike mentioned, they're mergers of traditional organizations, traditional working class organizations, and social movement activists. And I think I can just provide a bit of background about the lack of novelty of this through my own experience in the NDP. When I was a member of the NDP, during the anti-globalization movement, or what we now retrospectively call the alter-globalization movement, and the anti-war movement, the NDP was contemplating ditching its traditional base. It's a bit of a strange animal. And sorry, I'm speaking to a room full of Americans, so I should explain. The NDP is the New Democratic Party. It's Canada's Social Democratic Party. It's similar in some ways to the Labour Party in Britain, but it has different origins, which I'll briefly describe. Because Canada was such a rural country, the NDP wasn't a traditional outcome of trade union activism, at least in its earliest days when it was called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. Instead, it was largely a merger of activist farmers and then advocates of Christian social gospel. So it had a deeply religiously inspired background, and one of its first leaders as the CCF, J.S. Woodsworth, was, for example, a militant pacifist, or not militant, I should say, but a committed pacifist, and was the only man in the Canadian Parliament who opposed World War II. So it had this traditional base of farmers, and then through a merger in the early 1960s, when it merged with the Canadian Labour Congress, it became a coalition of trade union activists in the cities and then agricultural producers in the countryside. So throughout that history, it never entered government on a federal level, but governed several provinces and implemented a wide range of welfare state reforms like socialized healthcare, pensions, and supply management, and all sorts of things like that were often imitated by non-NDP governments in other provinces and by the federal government. So to fast forward a little bit, by the late 1990s, the NDP's traditional coalition base was starting to fracture, and it was less popular than ever after a series of stints in government during the recession in the early 1990s. In provincial governments, I should say. So activists within the party started looking in new directions for inspiration, and one of the things that seemed to be really happening at that point was the movements around globalization, around certain civil liberties issues, but also mainly international trade, exploitation of the third world, things of that nature. So there was an initiative within the party called the New Politics Initiative, which was essentially an attempt to disband the party and forge anew a coalition between the radical social movements and the old base. So this is something, it came to several national conventions of the party, and it eventually dissipated because the party elected a leader who the New Politics Initiative thought to be their man, Jack Layton, who became the leader of the federal NDP, and didn't come from the traditional constituencies of the NDP. He was a city councillor in Toronto, very personally liberal and a little bohemian, and they figured they'd found their man. So it dissipated, and Leighton became the leader. And many of us were very surprised when he took the party to the center. He abandoned a lot of the traditional demands of the NDP, committed it to balanced budgets every year, and really just kind of brought it into line with the neoliberal consensus in Canada. So I think it's kind of interesting wondering how this could happen, how what was supposed to be this initiative that would renew the party and bring it to the far left could actually wind up taking it to the most centrist, or you could even say right wing it's ever been. Oh, okay, wow, that went quickly. So I guess I'll just fast forward a bit, because the other thing that is worth talking about in terms of Canada, in terms of social movements in Canada, is what's happening in Quebec and what's been happening in Quebec. So you have an organized political party there, which is Quebec Solidaire, which is a coalition of the social movements in Quebec and the Union of Progressive Forces there. And then you have the student strikes. And there's a bit of, when people are talking about Canadian politics, there's a bit of a Quebec exceptionalism that's often attributed to its, you could say, to its more European heritage, its French language, its European culture. But I would also suggest that part of why things seem to be so heated and active in Quebec right now is actually the late origins of the welfare state there and the left there. Not to get too deep into Quebec's history, but it was a very conservative province until the 1960s, and then it elected a series of governments that kind of built a welfare state from scratch. Everything else had been previously done by the Catholic Church there in terms of education and social welfare. So now, belatedly, the governments there are trying to claw back these measures, just as happened across the rest of the Western world much earlier. And there's been a big push from principally led by young people there, but also public sector trade unions and some private sector trade unions against this. And one of the manifestations of that is the popularity of Quebec Solidaire, which, similarly to the sort of parties we were talking about before, is this coalition of a traditional base and some of the same faces that have been on the Quebec far left for a long time, and young activists. I suppose I should just wrap up there. And maybe we can kind of hash this out a bit more in the discussion.
Thank you. All right, so next we have Daniel.
Thanks. I have comments about this panel topic that will run in two directions. First, I will make a few comments about the recent Chicago Socialist campaign, which you all may have heard about. A united front of American left groups. Then I will give a few remarks about several recent projects I've been working on with the Labor Party of the Philippines. What you might find glaring vis-a-vis the topic of this panel is that in neither instance was there much of an international left to be seen. The former instance being in the end, entirely municipal, and the latter being myself in a broken chain of labor unions as the mediating entities between the Labor Party and the initiative that I was trying to pursue with different American unions. First, the Chicago Socialist campaign. Launched in a General Assembly type of meeting, open to the public, the initiative sought to draw together various left groups and former Occupy activists under the umbrella of a Kasama Sawant-style municipal-level campaign. The candidate who was eventually selected by the General Assembly, Jorge Mujica, eventually clinched 13% of the vote in the where he was running in the 25th ward. He was unfortunately challenged by not only another socialist, Ed Hershey of Spark, but also a group of merchants running their own candidate. The Chicago Socialist campaign hoped that this combination would work to their benefit by splitting the vote and forcing a runoff with the incumbent. In the meanwhile, Socialist Alternative, one of the members of this sort of united front of left groups, who we might think would have had the greatest interest in growing their municipal platform by establishing a friendly candidacy in Chicago, And by the way, if you're not familiar with the Socialist Alternative, they were behind Kshama Sawant in Seattle. Basically, they abandoned their campaign halfway through in Chicago, and the ISO, the International Socialists, dug in their heels. The result was that the incumbent handily won, and there has subsequently been a bit of chatter by campaign activists about starting an Illinois branch of SYRIZA, but if a nationally coordinated municipal level campaign can't yet bear fruit, how would this come about? And in all fairness, why wouldn't the Chicago Socialist campaign once opened up a branch in Greece? One could put that the other way around. Second, since 2012, I've been working with the Philippine Labor Party, Partido ng Manggagawa, regarding labor disputes that arise with an international character. The Philippine Labor Party has a strategy of organizing workers in unions and associations with the goal of electing a representative to the House. The Labor Party did play a key role in the impeachment of former President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, and they actually attempted to use this impeachment process as an opportunity to re-engineer the entire political system, which ultimately failed. But since the party has been marginalized, it currently remains active organizing in sectors such as business process outsourcing and free trade zones that have traditionally been no strike, no union shops. I've facilitated a small amount of correspondence with disputes arising from these organizing campaigns. The first dispute centered around a Cebu-based call center by the name of Leadomorphosis. And it was an American venture capitalist initiative. Basically, they closed down shop. Nearly 600 workers lost their jobs and their last month's pay plus Social Security. So the Labor Party, using a model they call organizing by fire, moved in, formed a workers' association kind of in the midst of this illegal closure, and they began a campaign to recuperate the lost wages, which I began to work on. The organization was eventually successful, and we were able to build up tenuous links to the American Union, the Communication Workers of America, and I attempted, with the help of a labor notes contact, to implement an institutional relationship between the Communication Workers of America and the Philippine Labor Party, which would have procured funds enough for them to mount an aggressive organizing campaign in the telecom sector in the Philippines. Yet our effort, despite garnering support from different American labor bodies, was blocked at the international level, the level of the CWA's International, on the basis of internal union politics. So I'm bringing up these two examples at the same time because, while an entity like the Philippine Labor Party is fairly eager to build out its political horizon internationally, ironically, no American counterpart exists to facilitate this project, much less correspondence. And while the Communication Workers of America needs to shut down AT&T's center in Cebu to clinch a mobility contract here in the United States, who do they expect to rely on? In the meantime, the left is still engaged in grassroots upsurge from below model that characterized Occupy, only in this instance actually without Kshama Sawant. While the left, particularly the ISO, has had much success organizing within unions such as the Chicago Teachers Union, it remains to be seen how the pieces connect nationally, let alone internationally, when the extra parliamentary pressure tendency of, say, Chris Hedges, for instance, of Occupy, has been carried over into the municipal political arena. So the question I would, I guess, want to leave with you is this idea of a unmediated, spontaneous action of civil society, if we can qualify that as revolutionary. And if that's a sort of effective perspective to take on thinking about international left politics. So just to close, Chris Hedges, in an interview with the Real News Network, has this quote where he talks about in 1971, Richard Nixon was kind of in the White House looking over a mass protest demonstration, and supposedly he was wringing his hands in fear that the protesters would break into the White House, and he was saying to Henry Kissinger, "My God, they're going to kill us." And Chris Hedges says, "Well, that's exactly where we want the people in power to be." But I would ask, is that an adequate form of politics for the left, internationally or nationally, for that matter?
All right. Thank you very much. And now we have Lucy Parker.
Okay, thank you. So I guess in thinking a little bit about this panel. I've also been in contact with one of our members from Platypus who can't be here today, Nikos Manoutsakis from Greece, just about Greece and the questions of left unity in general. But also we both worked together also with David to do an interview in the Platypus Review with a leading spokesperson from Podemos. So I've been thinking about that too. And I've also been reading Mike Macnair's book, Revolutionary Strategy, and thinking about that alongside the recent exchange that he and Chris Catrone have been having about the kind of issues raised in that book. So I don't know, my comments are going to be more in the form of kind of expanded questions. So I think to begin to think about what next for the left, there are some kind of other questions that we might want to try and unpack about the question of left unity or unity in general. So I guess the first one is, first question that is often raised on the subject of unity is unity with who? And so we've seen recently in the elections in Greece that SYRIZA has formed this coalition with the independent Greeks, this nationalist right-wing group, but also appointed many ex-members of PASOK to high positions within the government. So it kind of remains to be seen what will happen in that coalition, as Mike talked about. Then, I mean, the other current Greek leftist coalition groups. There's been Antasia as well, who are a kind of coalition of far left extra parliamentary groups, including the Greek SWP or International Socialists, Stalinists, and Trotskyist sects. And I think also recently there's been a kind of debate within Antasia about, in terms of the recent elections, whether to cooperate with Plan B, this group from one of the ex-leaders of Synapsismos, who was who was a main component of SYRIZA as well. And then you have the Greek Communist Party also seeking coalition under leadership and guidance of their party, but not really making any efforts concretely to accomplish that idea. And then with Podemos, in terms of like unity with who, it's a kind of broad coalition of people dissatisfied with mainstream parties, and yet also incorporating or having leadership from within it of some perhaps previously anti-capitalist left type groups, but with the idea of doing politics differently and also building a politics beyond the left and right. That was something that came up in the interview with Eduardo Maura. And so presumably that also means that they're open to unity with previously right-wing tendencies or right-wing political perspectives. So that's a question of who. Unity on what? I mean, I guess this is a question of political positions. And so one example of this is the question of like how national parties might in Europe might relate to the European Union. And SYRIZA and Podemos have both been, wanting to sort of participate within the European Union, even though they're critical of it in various ways, whereas Antasia has been a kind of more of an anti-EU perspective. And the CPGB within Left Unity has been recently, in terms of the questions they've been asking of current candidates in Left Unity, asking candidates to explicitly state whether they will argue against the ideas of kind of an anti-EU position. So in coming to these sorts of political positions outlined in a programme, I guess, what does it mean for those positions to be radical? And what would be the radical demands to make regarding the EU? I guess a position for or against being part of the European Union, a regional grouping of nation states, seems to raise questions about both how we understand internationalism as we also struggle with this historic problem of nationalism within the history of the left, and this kind of perhaps a national grouping or coalition of nation states. And then also this question of democracy. It's an ostensibly kind of democratic type organisation, but democracy under capitalism. And what are the restrictions there? So I guess we might also ask, looking at the history of the left, what Marxists are trying to do when they wrote programs in the past to address the question of internationalism and democracy. What were the role of parties for Marxists in developing the programme, and how did Marxists attempt to bring historical consciousness to both movements, the working class movement and the parties themselves? So I guess the third thing I wanted to raise was something that Mike touches on in his book, which is the question of unity and splits. So,
Lucy, sorry, you have 2 minutes.
Okay. So why make unity and why split? There's a kind of... Mike tries to kind of address how parties in the first, second and third internationals attempted to solve the problem of opportunism by splitting, but also at certain times through regroupment. And at times it appeared necessary for parties to draw together with others in broader organisations or parties, despite opportunist tendencies of some, around certain agreeable aims. And this was sometimes in the context of a kind of an expansion in numbers of the movement as a whole in the First and Second International. In certain circumstances, the challenge seems to have been for leftists to deal with opportunism, work with it whilst maintaining their own politics. But historically this has meant that self-censorship has sometimes occurred, or fudging and evading certain political issues in order to come to an appearance of an agreement. And retrospectively, we can assess whether certain unities or splits in any given situation were an appropriate decision to have been made. But I guess also for me, it raises the question of trying to understand what opportunism is per se. Where does it arise from? If it's something like tendencies to create a politics that affirms rather than negates the status quo, why do these tendencies arise? And Rosa Luxemburg in Reform and Revolution characterised opportunist politics as having an aversion to theory. But for her, a figure like Bernstein expressed a highest possible attempt to give opportunist politics a theoretical base, and hence provided her with something to critique imminently. And she does arrive at this idea of that Marxist doctrine, and by Marxist doctrine she meant Marxism, and she understood it from the Second International. Marxism alone can explain opportunism as a historic phenomenon in the development of the party. So for me, the question of opportunism, I realise I'm running out of time, but also the questions, the problematic questions of nationalism and how versus internationalism, and also democracy as an attempt to address another sort of problematic development that we've seen in the history of the left, of Bonapartism. How democracy relates to this question of Bonapartism is something that I've been wrestling with, and it seems to be, for me, important to think about it in terms of them being historically constituted phenomena within the development of left parties and movements. Okay, I'm going to end there, but I maybe add more later on.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now we have Ugur.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming. So I think one of the things that we all see in the context of Middle East and Western Europe right now is that the left, which is whatever we might define it as, has seized an immense political opportunity for a breakthrough into governing political positions, especially in Europe and parts of the Middle East. One of the books I've been reading lately was Doc McAdams' Comparative Perspectives on Social Movements. And one of the things he claims is that political opportunities arise during times of change in institutional structure. And when we look at this in the perspective of Middle East and Turkey, I think this change in institutional structure sort of made a breakthrough for a coalition in Turkey to come about. Some of those institutional changes were the 1980 political coup that Turkey went through, the rising Kurdish struggle as a byproduct of that, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and another byproduct of the military coup, which was the 10% election threshold. So while many turn to Podemos in Spain and SYRIZA in Greece, I think in the Middle East, or as, I don't know, it's a debate in where we position Turkey, whether in the Middle East or whether as a part of Europe. But for the sake of argument, I'll sort of try to position it as a part of the Middle East. I think a progressive, locally governed alternative is on the rise. And this is a coalition mainly of the Kurdish struggle and the progressive movements that push for what has been formulated as a model for governance called democratic autonomy. So in this model for pushing for democratic autonomy, People's Democratic Party has been formed as a coalition of 35 different political parties, NGOs, and union organizations. To say the least, within this coalition, the Kurdish emancipation movement is the primary driving actor, with the broadest popular support and monetary ends to its goal as well. But as we go about, one of the issues that we were discussing is whether this movement is actually new. I would say yes and no. There are ties to a lot of the organizations we have within People's Democratic Party that were very active in the 60s and 70s during the Cold War era, before Turkey was sort of washed away by the 1980 military coup, a NATO-allied military coup. So when we look at some of the member organizations of the coalition here, we see a lot of new members as well. We see a lot of LGBT rights organizations. We see the Green Party. We see Trotskyists, Marxist-Leninists, and Maoists sort of trying to work together and look at different, sort of like amend their differences. We see feminist organizations, local ecologist organizations, and for the first time an alliance of Armenian Democrats working together within this coalition as well. As I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons what drove this coalition was actually a byproduct of anti-democratic measures in Turkey, which pushes a lot of these minorities and a lot of the socialist left to run independently in elections, because if you run as a party, there's no chance you can break 10% election threshold. So that was one of the reasons why we formed the 1,000 Hope candidates in 2007. And that was the first time ever since the military coup that socialists, Kurdish, and Kurdish MPs were represented in the parliament, because they ran on independent tickets and gathered about 1.5 million votes, which secured 22 tickets in the parliament. And ever since, this bloc has been increasing. When we started in 2007, there were only 4 parties in this coalition. In 2011, with the coming of the elections in 2011, the bloc was restructured into Labour, Democracy and Freedom bloc, and this time drew 2.5 million votes and secured 36 seats in the parliament. And at this point, the coalition had broadened into 19 political parties. What we recently went through was 2 elections back-to-back in 2014, the local elections and the presidential election. The presidential election especially gave this coalition a breakthrough because there was no election threshold to join the presidential election. And as we ran with our candidate, this time the bloc was able to gather 4 million votes, driving the bar up to 9.8%. So this gives the People's Democratic Party a chance to actually run on its own tickets in the upcoming June 2015 elections to pass the 10% election threshold. And to move forward, this coalition has made its own sort of political agenda to push for becoming the main opposition in 2019, and hopefully putting a new agenda for governance in Turkey. I think some of the other new things as the left is experiencing across the world, but very important in the context of Middle East, is that this movement has pushed forward gender quotas. So we see a 10% LGBTI and a 50% women's quota in every decision-making body of the party. And moving forward, we also pushed for a co-chairmanship system, which basically rules that every decision-making body of the party, whether it be the central committee or the heads of the party, there has to be co-chairs from both genders, and the assemblies cannot be ruled in the absence of the woman co-chair.
You have 2 minutes, okay.
Thank you. So I think one other thing as we move forward, and we see what SYRIZA forming a government in Greece, and the Kurdish struggle really taking a new dimension against ISIS in northern Syria, is that the left has been in either local or hopefully in the future in Europe, national governing positions. This is very important because I believe for pushing models such as self-governance, a democratic socialism, and we need to be building our constructive reflexes again, in the face of criticizing neoliberalism. And I believe that what has been turning a lot of masses into a leftist agenda back again is the will, is that these organizations has shown, I believe, that they can and they will govern, and has made an extensive emphasis on local administrations. So I believe that I'll try to leave it here and then come back again to questions.
Okay, great. All right, so we've had many, I think, good issues brought up here. I'm going to open it up for discussion. I think just to recap a little bit some of the issues that have been raised. I mean, one question that has been brought up is the relative to extent to which what we're seeing are new developments or continuation of the old. That's kind of been a running theme. Something that I believe Lucy brought up into the conversation is the question of the history, the sort of long history, deep history of Marxism in particular, and the left, and what that can, how that can inform our debate today. Yes, finally, the other question, which both Ugur and Dan and Cam brought up, is this question of these a sort of grassroots mobilization and local elections as models for thinking about the international left. So, we'll start with Mike and just go down the line. Everybody will have 3 to 4 minutes to raise any issues that they would like.
Okay, so this is to respond to what the other speakers have said. I think that the difficulty, I would address 2 particular issues, one of which is Uru's stuff, and the other is Lucy's. I think the difficulty with the perspective of saying constructive role in government is that what is the SYRIZA people are experiencing at the moment is precisely that to be in government forces you to make choices about how the state is going to pay for the things which it has to pay for, and that in turn forces you to play the geopolitics game, but also to play the competitiveness game. I'm more I would be more. So I'm sort of. I think it's quite problematic to accept responsibility for national government without a very clear mandate to transform the structures, that's the problem, it seems to me, partly the problem which SYRIZA faces as well, is they have not got a clear mandate to transform the structures. The question that Lucy raised is related to the question the Europe question. The Europe, which is related to the Turkey question as well. The problem essentially is the Soviet Union attempted socialism in one country under the ideal conditions for socialism in one country. I say under ideal conditions because precisely because of the relative backwardness of the Russian economy, there was low level of integration of the Russian economy into the world economy, and that low level of integration of the Russian economy into the world economy meant that it was possible to run an autarkic model of the economy. In reality, it turned out not to be possible to run an autarkic model of the economy, and the pressure which that put in order to engage in industrial development, it was necessary to screw the working class in order to get the high-tech stuff, except for the brief period when there was a great tech dump from the United States and the UK into Russia for reasons of military alliance in 1941-45. Otherwise, it was necessary to screw the working class and the peasants in order to get the tech imports which were needed. The same is true of any of the individual countries in the European Union. Greece, of course, has not been able to feed itself out of its own agriculture since at the latest 500 BC. The need for integration means that socialism in a single country now looks like socialism in Illinois on its own. Could you separate off the Illinois economy from the rest of the US economy and build socialism? The answer is quite clearly you couldn't. Or socialism in Saxony on its own in the period of the German customs union. We are no longer in a world in which this sort of project of socialism on its own makes any, in a single country, makes any sort of sense. Hence, as far as CPGB is concerned in relation to the European Union, Alan Thornett and co say, the people who are for pull out of the EU, say, the EU is boss's club. The constitution is set up so that the bosses control. Well, and our answer is, the United Kingdom is a boss's club. The United Kingdom constitution is set up so that the bosses control what happened. Turkey is a boss's club. So that it's the question which is posed is simply, at what level can the working class talk seriously about taking power? The other side of this coin, however, is as far as local government is concerned, yes, it is possible within the framework of being stuck with the budgets to do things in local government. And that's the history of sewer socialism in the United States, of municipal socialism in the UK, in France, etc., of the pre-war, pre-1914 international socialist movement. And we do need to get back. Some of the things we need to get back are things which go back to before the 20th century. Cheers.
Okay.
So,
thank you. Kat?
Yeah, I'll keep it pretty brief. Just having listened to the remarks, I think one of the things that occurs to me is often these sort of various lash-ups kind of come into being without too much discussion, too much argument about the intent of the project and whether the intent is to take power at some sort of level, whether municipal or larger, or whether the intent is to build some sort of alternative power structure outside of kind of government structures. So we had a case, just because it occurred to me I didn't speak too much about specifically local politics, although everything in Canada is kind of local. In Toronto, there was a group called the Workers' Assembly that was going to be a coalition of all the various disparate far-left organizations in the city. And it came into being because, like, a few, organizers in the city realized that there needed to be an assembly like this, but it never really went further than the fact that there should be some sort of forum for people committed to radical social change getting together and discussing, how wrong the world is and what could be done about it. So it all fell apart because often these unity coalitions aren't, they're less than the sum of their parts in some ways, because you had people who were very traditional Marxist academics or Marxists coming out of the trade union movement, allied with a certain contemporary flavor of leftism that's very much about defending people against attacks on their personal identity or specific single issues, and without kind of discussing this before getting together, and in fact avoiding it because it would be a point of disagreement that might jeopardize the coalition. They all got together, and then it became a sticking point, like whether this new organization could even collect dues. Because some people in the organization argued that dues were inherently oppressive and exclusive because not everyone can afford to pay them. So it kind of, how are you going to have a functional organization if you can't raise some money for it? And that kind of, I suppose the point I'm making is that just like in terms of a lot of these associations, there's not really the process of productive disagreement that needs to happen before there's an attempt at unity. So I'll pass it off after that.
Yeah, and this question of local governance as a sort of campaign platform and a campaign objective, I think you do have to ask, like Mike said, what will it deliver? And right now, specifically, what will it deliver in the context of a global economic crisis? When there's not necessarily even funding for the delivery of what we might assume a model of local governance would actually would result in. So if the sort of ideal of local governance, that's somehow closer to socialism, if you will, this sort of correlation between local governance as being a bit more egalitarian or a bit more a step towards socialism. If there's not a sort of a revenue stream to deliver on the promises that, say, the municipality makes or the alderman makes, what's the point? Will it deliver the goods? And the answer might be no. And then there's also another issue that crops up when you do actually achieve a local governance model, like in the Philippines, which has the barangay system. The barangay is the smallest unit of government, but it's politically political context in the Philippines is very stricken by corruption, political cronyism on this sort of local scale, and on the national scale, political dynasties who have a sort of relationship with the barangays of buying votes. It seems to happen more and more every year. So I guess I would just raise the question, what is it possible for local governance as a platform to deliver on its promises once it becomes implemented?
Okay, I think I'll just, for the moment, try and think a little bit more about this question of democracy in relation to various forms that we might see of Bonapartism, and it's just been a kind of a thing that's still being addressed and talked about today in discussions that in Left Unity, or at least pushed by the CPG, maybe. But again, how the democracy, both at a local level and then at a kind of at an EU or a kind of international level, is more democracy in and of itself enough to challenge the problem of Bonapartism, or the problem of the capitalist state, I guess. I'm just thinking maybe one example might be Podemos, although there's many ways in which Podemos as a kind of organisation is kind of difficult because it doesn't consider itself necessarily left-wing, but it's trying to do something different. But it has this, in terms of decision-making, has this kind of idea of local circles within which decisions, or focus groups within which decisions can be made, that then kind of feed into the bigger project. And that's been a kind of strong element in terms of its structure that it's pushed for, as well as this question of greater transparency and arguing for greater transparency in order to challenge a potential corruption within the EU or at a national level within Spain. And so it has this idea of kind of greater democracy in various ways, or greater transparency, and yet has also relied upon having this incredibly charismatic young figure of Iglesias, kind of in order to kind of rally everyone together. And so that's kind of interesting tension somehow. And I suppose I'm just interested to hear more maybe from other people in the audience about how whether more democracy, extreme democracy, as Mike uses the term in his book, can challenge the kind of historic problem of Bonapartism within leftist organisations.
Great, thank you.
To sort of talk about local governance, I think it becomes very important. The way you locally organize and try to govern becomes really important, especially when you separate out and sort of try to see which region in the context of which conflicts or political spheres that influence it. For example, in the case of Syria and Turkey, when we look at it, two issues arise. When we talk about urban issues, we see the effects of gentrification, the push of minorities, the working class, the poor, and the LGBT communities outside city centers. And as a byproduct of that, the less and less sort of involvement of these communities in politics. So one thing to question is whether if you do locally govern in an urban space, can you push for the inclusion of these, inclusion of the working class and inclusion of the minorities within governing structures again? I think which is a little bit more important in the case of the Kurdish question becomes a little bit more crystal clear, is that we live in a sectarian, we live in a region that has a lot of sectarian and religious conflict. So local governance becomes very important, and how you do it becomes very delicate. How much of these different sects and religions can you include in your governance model? And another question that was raised was, how do you derive the revenue for these local government projects? So in order to do so, you need to have a very concrete plan in how you're going to derive revenue. How much autonomy can you actually get from the country you actually live in and the central government? And obviously, in the regional context, another issue is whether, even if you locally govern, can you use the oil in the area and be able to finance your projects with this money that you should be, with this oil that the Kurds should be extracting and using for their own local governance models. So I believe the separation of urban spaces and spaces in sectarian and religious conflict is sort of important in sort of us trying to see this local governance game. And I believe the gentrification issue not solely is about big cities in the Middle East, but is also about a question that is important for Western Europe and the United States as well.
Okay. All right, thank you. So now we're going to open it up to the audience for any questions that you have. All right, yes?
Yes, my question is for Mike, Mike Macnair.
Sorry, who's your name?
Oliver Smith.
Oliver. Right, thanks.
My question is, you speak of the geopolitical struggle of SYRIZA with to as you say, outflank NATO with Putin's Russia, and I was wondering if you would comment on the recent geopolitical economic demands of SYRIZA, in which they are demanding reparations from Germany, and how that relates to their debt, and which, just your what you have to say about that.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Quick, okay, that's dead quick. It's a nice piece of rhetoric. What I'm saying about the SYRIZA and Russia is simply that SYRIZA is playing a political game in which they are threatening the United States with an alliance with Russia, which would cause problems for the United States in relation to its Balkans and South Black Sea, Balkans Black Sea strategy. That's no more than a threat. But in relation to the German reparations, it's a lovely piece of political rhetoric. The reality is here, who the hell are the Germans? The point is, who the hell are the Germans to be demanding that all debts must be paid? When no reparations were demanded, well, reparations were agreed in 1945 and then were dropped as part of the formation of the NATO and the Cold War arrangements. So that it's not just that reparations are owing to Greece but were forgiven. They're also owing to Britain but were forgiven, and they're owing to the United States but were forgiven. And very large debt, because German rearmament in 1930s was basically funded by US banks. Very large debts are owed to US banks from Germany, which were forgiven in connection with the Cold War. So that it's a lovely rhetorical point, and it has a certain level of that you could play a game which says that if it's in the interest of the United States to stop Greece going off into alliance with Putin's Russia, then the United States can say, actually, we agree with the Greeks. Germany, if you're going to demand these Greek debts are all paid and not let the Greeks off, we're going to insist that you pay the stuff which we let you off in the 1950s. If that happened, then the Germans would certainly cave. The question is what the political implications of that would be. And my point about this whole technique is simply that this whole technique points in the direction of a world of imperialist blocs with bilateral trading relations between big powers and small powers. Not that we'd jump immediately into 1914, but that we're points in the direction of what led up to 1914.
Thank you.
Ed, and then what do you want to add?
My question is, how do you want the left to change, and who do you think is responsible for that change, or is in a position to take responsibility for that change? I think that's been touched on to some degree, and obviously it would be unrealistic and probably undesirable to ask that the entire left think exactly as oneself. So in that spirit, do you identify as any particular organizations that you think are strategically important, or any particular institutions, and are there particular ideologies or practices that you see as potentially able to turn a corner on the left? Are there those that you think are particularly odious or bound up with the kind of status quo of death and kind of blockage in much of the left? And especially insofar as ultimately, I think for at least 4 of you, if not all of you, the goal would be global socialism. So what is the kind of next link in the chain if the left is actually to begin a process of advancing that goal?
Does anyone want to begin?
I think what we've been talking about a bit has been left unity projects today. I'm just thinking about the character of them as opposed to kind of the mass working class movements for socialism in the past. What it might take to build those sorts of parties again is a big question, and might raise new, different problems for us to address as well as the left or whatever the left might be. I guess trying to think about how organisations today, I wouldn't point to any particular organisation today that I would see as holding up a kind of banner of any sort of ideal model of big left mass party. I don't think there are any mass working class organisations that in the same character as the Second International had. So what it would take to transform the organisations that are in place today into really viable material forces in society again is complicated, but I think it is bound up with this question how we transform the left. I think there is an ideological investigation that needs to be sort of undertaken to transform the left. But that doesn't mean we can't maybe think about. We need all sorts of different organisations, I think, to begin to transform the situation that we're in today. I think that would be one thing to say. But I think it's important to ask the kind of more the ideological questions as well as the kind of the project of building parties too. I think they're obviously linked together, but not entirely the same thing maybe.
Okay. Did anyone else want to address this question?
I can address it.
Yeah. Okay.
So, if we think about how the left approaches politics, especially from the perspective of the new left, we can kind of identify this fetishization of spontaneous localism, some sort of belief that if you go to the people and the people will just tell you what needs to be done, or if you identify a hotspot, for instance, there's something happening in Ferguson, so let's go to Ferguson, and then we can identify what the next step is. So this sort of I guess a tendency to not really attempt to theorize a position and then go from there, but rather to kind of project this idea of direct democracy when it doesn't exist, and then act on it is a problem that needs to be addressed. And it's not to say that the left today doesn't have the capacity to constitute the type of party that Lucy's talking about. I think there's no desire to do so because of the perspective that the left has on activism and how it carries it out. I think that would have to change before what you suggest, some sort of international movement for socialism, could possibly emerge.
Yeah, I think to quickly talk about how I think left, in the context of North Africa and Middle East, should reform itself is sort of one thing that I think is going to be very important is to have women talk for themselves. We still see a lot of socialist, communist movements as blocks of men who are telling or sort of forming policies that try to sort of direct a lot of feminist organizations or different organizations within these countries. And in the context of the Arab world and Africa, when we look at this, the women's issue is very important and the minorities issues are very important. So seeing how that is going to transform and how the left will transform itself by, I think, talking and organizing together, protesting together with different organizations and with different rights organizations, I think is a challenge for the left to see and would, I think, be very beneficial for the region in its entirety.
Who has most leverage? It varies from country to country who has the most leverage. Therefore, characteristically, it's the people who have, whoever it is, who has taken the initiative in creating some degree of unity. Now, I don't count left unity in Britain as that, because it isn't. It's not a, in spite of its name, it's not a unity project. It's a new left group formed by a few ex-communists and various groups of ex-Trotskyists, primarily animated by the British section of the Fourth International and its ex-members. But in, say, for example, it happens to be the case, the Commodore has described to us the way in which the Kurdish movement has become the animating force, has become the group which has the most leverage by virtue of its having taken an opening up initiative. Similarly, the KKE Interior took an opening up initiative and became thereby the group with most leverage. Rifondazione by taking... So, in all of these cases, the people who take the opening up initiative, having enough forces to do it in the first place, are the ones who have the most leverage. What's demanded of them is to stick with the element of the opening up initiative, which is that there should be discussion and debate. Not just that there should be a formal right to have platforms, which it's relatively easy to concede, a formal right to have platforms, but at the same time run everything in such a way that whoever you vote for, the government gets in. But that there should be definitely open discussion. Flip side of this, who is most trapped? You asked for the negative side of it. Who is most trapped in existing ways of doing things? The answer as now is the traditional Trotskyist left. Is most trapped because they've stuck themselves to a conception of leadership which entails that the centre, the party represents the whole as against the class, the actual class, and the National Committee represents the whole as against the actual members of the party, and the Political Bureau represents the whole as against the actual members of the National Committee. This is the 1921 model, which is actually a model of how to construct a man on white horseback to lead the peasantry to defeat the landlord class and nothing else. And they've stuck themselves with that, and the consequence is that they're trapped against taking the sort of initiatives which could make a profound difference. Okay, we're not in the same position as the creation of the German SPD out of an initial explosion of workers' movement, but we can be in the same position as the people who created the British Labour Party, not as the first wave of working class organisation, as the third wave, the fourth wave of working class organisation, starting with grouplets, but nonetheless addressing the question of organisation on a larger scale. At the moment, I think it's right. I can't remember, Dan, I think it was, said it's essentially we aren't doing it because we don't want to, rather than we aren't doing it because we can't. Because our forces are not that much weaker than the forces who set out to create the British Labour Party or the American Socialist Party when it was in its big phase in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Our forces are not that much weaker. Our problem is we're stuck with the monolithic party, socialism in a single country, the dictatorship of the proletariat in a single country, as the Trotskyist conceptions, the New Left conceptions, and these are obstacles to us thinking how to change things.
Thank you, Mike. And I wanted to make sure that we get more questions. And I know that you had a question.
Yeah, my question, so the majority of the discussion talking about the future of Greece seems to be revolving around whether or not there will be a Brexit from the Eurozone. And it seems to be that the SYRIZA party itself is pretty divided amongst those that believe, like Varoufakis, that we can reform the euro sort of to a good euro, and then also those that believe that we need to totally reform the euro in order to have any sort of, I guess, reform. My question for you guys is, what do you think, A, what do you think will happen, basically? Or will they exit, will they not? And B, what do you think maybe should happen in order to, I guess...
Okay. Anyone want to volunteer?
I don't think they will leave. I don't know. I mean, I'm not really. I'm not an expert on this, but I think rather what will happen is that they will be forced to enact austerity measures, even despite the rhetoric against those, and Greece won't leave the EU. That's my feeling. But I'm sorry, it's not very well concretized. But I think you know things for people in Greece are still going to be pretty grim for the next period of time. That's my thought.
I don't think they will be leaving the EU either. I think the big question for SYRIZA, or how Greece will structure itself, is how much of political support can SYRIZA still drive while in government and trying to figure out a way out of this. And in doing so, can they build an economic model that is going to sustain further growth, drive employment, and sort of a hope for future for them? Because regardless of them having great support within Greece right now, that support looks pretty shaky. And that is a group of people that is sort of like a vacuum that can be pushed towards any other movement if SYRIZA is to fail. So that, I believe, the biggest challenge for Greeks is deciding on whether they want to keep up with this alternative and give SYRIZA more of a leeway in trying to handle this, or quit it altogether and then look. But the question then is like, look to who and look where.
Just briefly, and I can only say this as someone, I read a bit about Greece, I'm not intimately familiar, but there tends to be a historical pattern in which social democrats get elected during these crunches and wind up being the ones who administer austerity as the most able to sell it to their base. It's something that happened where I live. It happened in Britain and France. So, I mean, the cynic in me says that they'll probably prove to be a safe pair of hands, and we'll be able to kind of have some measures that alleviate some of the worst suffering of people there, but wind up staying in the EU and kind of forcing some measure of austerity on the people of Greece. And I think going back to the discussion about reparations, it's kind of weird because it's a nationalistic way of kind of tacitly admitting that their salvation lies with Germany, and that in terms of like looking for an exit from this choice between austerity or autarky and just being expelled from the EU, or having their currency collapse or whatever else, that ultimately their fate is kind of tied into the fates of continental Europeans and Britons and people in the rest of the world, and that there needs to be substantial political change in those countries, and that is the only real way forward for Greece.
At the moment, it's very difficult to see how anything can happen other than Brexit from the euro, you know, and Brexit, Greek exit from the euro, simply because, as I said, the only way in which that's not going to happen is if the United States leans on Germany. The United States obviously could lean on Germany to force concessions to Greece, and it might have interests in doing so. But the problem essentially if you think about the question, why is it the case that nobody has backed the Greek call elsewhere in Europe other than groups of the left who are nowhere close to political power? And the answer is because as soon as you concede that there's got to be a write-down of Greek debt, then you have to concede that there has to be a write-down of Irish debt, write-down of Spanish debt, write-down of Portuguese debt, write-down of Italian debt, probably in fact a write-down of French debt. Okay, take it that there is no possibility of the immediate overthrow of capitalism on a Europe-wide scale, which there is reality, just we're not there yet. The best way out would indeed be for there to be a general write-down of these debts. 1720 South Sea bubble, this Bubble Act cuts all debts contracted in the bubble period. No more than 2/3 of that debt is recoverable by action at law. That's what happens in a crisis. What allows a crisis to create a new period of growth afterwards is the destruction of capital values. So what needs to happen is the destruction of capital values. Doesn't look like it's going to happen. It looks like what's going to happen is that there will be Grexit and there will be mass starvation because the Germans and the French and the North Europeans in general will be determined to show the Spanish, the Italians, etc., that what you get if you vote in a left-wing government is mass starvation. And it's unlikely that they will stop short of hundreds of thousands of people dying of starvation on the streets. It's just unlikely. The only way out of that is if it turns into a geopolitical manoeuvres.
Okay. All right. Do we have more questions? Yes.
Just to raise this question of the lack of a will to really reconstitute the left, and to relate that to the issue of ideology and the question of political representation of representing ideological points of view. Because it seems to me that we shouldn't be too careful. We shouldn't be too quick to think that social groups have natural ideological expressions, but rather there's a contestation about what is working class politics, what would a working class program be, etc. And obviously, Platypus is interested in ideological debate, in hosting a conversation, in some ways of melting or decomposing a kind of rigidity that is inherited historically. Might refer to this in his own way by talking about socialism in one country, Stalinism, Trotskyism. What do we see in the wider left? And this would get to issues of, rather than simply talking about scale, municipal versus larger scale taking power, and what you can do with resources on the local level, greater relative autonomy on the local level. It would raise issues like, raising, even Ksama Sawant in Seattle isn't really in a position to do any of that, right? It's really about the role of electoral politics. and potentially the role of discussing changes in the law, even without power, right? So the question of representation at the level of elected representatives as a way of addressing an ideological impasse, right, in a wider society, as a counterpart and in parallel with the impasse on the left. Right, and my question is, what do we see in the wider organized left? Particularly, we're talking about people who, in one way or another, are attempting to engage the electoral arena. As how successful are they? Is there anything hopeful about the way in which these parties, movements, right? Because that's the other question out there, is the legacy of the new left and movement as the way of addressing public sphere and representation and debate, right? Raising it on the street and banners and avoiding organized politics in a certain way. It's a strongly different model than the Second International and ideological contestation amongst a broadly socialist working class. So with these movements, Podemos, the SYRIZA movement and movement parties, how likely is it that they, even without taking power, without being the ones to administer the austerity, without being the ones to have to negotiate scarce resources, how do these movements threaten to actively disorganize and make our situation worse, right? By failing to address the question of how to address the impasse at the level of ideology and the legacy of the history of the left and society as a whole.
Okay. Would anyone like to volunteer to take this first?
I have a brief comment. I mean, at one point in the Chicago Socialist campaign, there was actually a debate about whether or not this was a propaganda campaign, and it wasn't. There's like no clear answer to that question, and so you could say the same thing of Khassama Sawant's campaign. Is it a propaganda campaign addressing society at large, or ostensibly, you could say perhaps addressing the working class, or there's some sort of realization by the working class that it is the working class as a result of these municipal level campaigns. But I don't think there's any clarity as to A, whether that's even achievable, or B, if that's the objective. So I think that's quite muddy. Like, what is this sort of municipal strategy on the American left? I don't think that's clear at all.
I had something to say, but I think that there has, with the organisations like Podemos, with this beyond left and right, and with SYRIZA also, even though I think they still have some kind of self-conception of being left, it seems like there's just a kind of attempt to muddy over this question of what it might be to transform, to overcome capitalism on a global scale. But I think in a sense, they're limited by their concrete position as, not being the most advanced, or most powerful capitalist countries in the world. That they're limited in what they can do, and so it's a kind of expression of an attempt to try and defend and resist kind of austerity measures that have been enacted. But what's kind of depressing is to see the sort of far left in Britain and elsewhere simply cheerlead for these types of organisation and say this is what we need here, or even to express a kind of criticality by saying, "Oh, these movements are reformist," which kind of begs the question: can you have reformism without some kind of idea of revolution as well? And I mean, certainly, I just remember talking to the AWL about this. They were kind of, really surprised, or kind of, really excited about the idea of SYRIZA getting into power, and it was just kind of, and their way of articulating it was in terms of like, well, we need to go through this experience together with the working class in order for them to, come to the realization that this is not going to be the way forward somehow. And yet, simply through kind of going through that experience, it seems like it leaves aside, it does just become a kind of just endorsement, cheerleading of these movements, and
as if they know what the lesson the working class would draw from that defeat would be.
Right. And so, I don't know. I mean, I think it's. I'm incredibly sympathetic, actually, in a sense, to what the movements are attempting. But I think it also it says something about the state of the left internationally that we can but it seems like we can but cheerlead these movements, and what it would really take to like make to transform the left in like the United States, as other people have talked about too, and in Britain, but it's still a kind of like huge question, I guess. I don't know if that really addresses what you're saying, but the question of will or wanting to do that, I think that does come down again to the question of the left. And while so we've kind of come full circle, I guess, perhaps not answer the question, but I think for me that's why the question of the left still needs to be posed as such.
I don't know if this directly addresses it. I'll try to, though. I think in sort of trying to understand the differences and we look at issues, the issue of the context of the problem and the regionality of the problem is very crucial. And whether the theoretical debates we have over issues is also very keen, but I think one thing that is very important is to see the priorities of the left in different regional contexts as well. When you look at semi-dictatorships like Turkey, or when you look at dictatorships across the Arab world, you see the left, various parts of the left dealing with different issues than the American left or the North American left deals with. And the degree to how much autonomy you can get or how much vacuum you can drive, I think, is also different, because in a constitutional democracy where the rules are very much set by the basically capital, it becomes much harder for local administrations to seek power and then drive these efforts. Whereas in semi-autonomous regions like Syria and Iraq, when you look at Northern African examples, or the other parts of the Arab world, then you can see people having the ability to create vacuums and actually claim socialist or direct democracy autonomies, and then drive change or sort of like push agenda towards that. So I think it very much depends on the context and regionality of the argument.
Mike, do you want to say something?
Yeah, it's just, I thought a good point in Spencer's question, that he's not answering the question, is the point that by electoral activity, what you're doing is posing the question of changing the law. You know? I think which goes along with that, it seems to me, is okay. This is goddamn orthodoxy, Plekhanov. Propaganda is saying many ideas to few people, and it's what you do with newspapers, books, pamphlets, websites, stuff like that. Agitation is saying few ideas to many people. In that context, the idea of a propaganda electoral intervention is a complete waste of space. Because the only point in doing electoral intervention is to try and address the whole electorate with a few ideas. And those few ideas also have to be very much ideas which are ideas which are connected to a change in the law. I wrote on Magna Carta the last couple of weeks ago for Weekly Worker, and one of the things I came across looking it up, I didn't use it there, was Marx's quote where he says a modest Magna Carta, that the 8-hour day bill, 10-hour day bill was a modest Magna Carta of the working class. Which is a point which he makes repeatedly when Marx is talking about the political action of the working class as against the Proudhonists, as against the Bakuninists, and the modern far left are Bakuninists. They won't admit they're Bakuninists, but they're actually Bakuninists. The political action is the action which is directed towards making a general rule for the society as a whole. Now, that doesn't have to be being the government, and it doesn't have to be controlling the budget, because you could make a rule, say SYRIZA. What would my personal, this is not CPGB's advice, my personal advice to SYRIZA on winning their majority would have been, okay, now you form a coalition to abolish this anti-democratic 50-seat rule. Abolish it and call fresh elections, so that there'd be a parliament which is actually representative of the political views within the society. Yeah? And then the question will arise, are you in a position to take power and implement your programme? And if you've won a majority, maybe you're in a position to take power and implement your programme by disposing of the judiciary. Clearly there needs to be a purge of the Greek judiciary. In reality, from the Germans' point of view, there ought to be a purge of the Greek judiciary, because the Greek judiciary has essentially been letting the Greek rich off paying their taxes. A purge of the Greek judiciary would be a necessary step on any view. But you don't have to. The left thinks of it as you've got to form a government, even if it means you form a government under conditions where you can't really do anything. But that just leads to demoralisation. Lucy's point. You have to go through together with the working class. No doubt the AWL will want to go through together with the working class after that the experience of voting for Golden Dawn and getting a fascist government, or getting a military dictatorship. It seems to me is the most likely outcome of the failure of SYRIZA.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to address this question? Cam?
Sure. I suspect we're getting to the end, but just to get... One thing I drew from what Spencer asked was about how these new or seemingly new forms of organization can become a barrier, like a barrier to discussion of ideas and the sort of clarity that can bring. Like the example you mentioned earlier, Dan, of the Illinois SYRIZA, that there can just, or like when SYRIZA was becoming popular in Greece and was making it into North American news, people where I live started saying, "Oh, we need a Toronto SYRIZA or a Canadian SYRIZA." So it becomes this sort of like obsession with process and the form of organization that can obscure what should be the proper end of political organizing, like where we want to go. And having kind of spent a good amount of time on the far left, it's been interesting for me to see how things go from being bad ideas to popular ideas to orthodoxy, and just the transformation that takes place. And like I felt that during Occupy, and I feel it now in terms of the forms of student organizing that happen in Toronto or other ways, and that they always kind of spend so much time trying to perfect the model before it actually gets out there and gets tested in political intervention.